The summer heat pressed down on the quiet suburban street as Officer Derek Matthews pulled his patrol car behind a silver Honda Civic. His jaw tightened as he watched the car sitting at the intersection, taking what he considered too long to make a turn. Through his windshield, he could make out the silhouette of the driver, a young black woman who appeared to be looking at her phone. His hand moved instinctively to his radio as he called in the stop, his voice carrying that familiar edge of suspicion that had become second nature over his 15 years on the force. The young woman, 23-year-old Maya Johnson, glanced in her rearview mirror and felt her stomach drop. She had been using her GPS to find the correct address in this unfamiliar neighborhood, trying to locate the community center where she was scheduled to give a presentation. Her hands trembled slightly as she carefully pulled over to the curb, making sure to use her turn signal and come to a complete stop. She had been through this before, had heard the stories, had received the talk from her parents about what to do when pulled over by police. Keep your hands visible. Don't make sudden movements. Be respectful. Stay calm. Officer Matthews approached the vehicle with heavy steps, his hand resting on his service weapon. Years of what he called street experience had taught him to be cautious, though others might have called it something else entirely. He had convinced himself that his instincts were sharp, that he could spot trouble before it started. But those instincts were clouded by biases he refused to acknowledge, assumptions that had calcified into certainty over countless interactions where he saw threats instead of people. Maya rolled down her window slowly, keeping both hands on the steering wheel just as she had been taught. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. She was dressed professionally in a blazer and blouse, her natural hair pulled back neatly, her laptop bag visible on the passenger seat. She had done nothing wrong, she reminded herself. She was simply trying to find her destination. The officer's voice cut through the humid air, sharp and accusatory. He demanded to know why she had been sitting at the intersection for so long, why she appeared to be distracted, whether she had been drinking. Maya explained calmly that she was looking for an address, that she was on her way to the Lincoln Heights Community Center for a scheduled event. Her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She reached slowly toward her glove compartment to retrieve her registration, narrating her movements as she had been taught to do. But Officer Matthews saw something else in that movement. His prejudices painted a different picture, one colored by years of assumptions and stereotypes. His hand moved to his weapon, fingers wrapping around the grip. The afternoon sun glinted off the gun as he drew it, his voice rising to a shout as he ordered her to show her hands. Maya froze, her fingers inches from the glove compartment, her eyes wide with terror. Time seemed to slow down as she looked at the barrel of the gun pointed at her through the window. The street, which had been quiet moments before, suddenly felt alive with witnesses. A woman walking her dog stopped on the sidewalk, her phone already out and recording. An elderly man tending his garden looked up in alarm. Inside her car, Maya's mind raced through 1,000 thoughts. She thought of her parents, of the work she had devoted her life to, of how a routine traffic stop had escalated into a moment where her life hung in the balance. She thought of all the names she had heard on the news, all the lives cut short in moments just like this one. Officer Matthews barked commands, his adrenaline surging, his training failing him in the moment when it mattered most. He ordered her out of the car, his weapon still drawn and pointed. Maya complied slowly, carefully, her hands raised high above her head. Tears streamed down her face, but she maintained her composure, speaking in a clear voice that trembled only slightly. She told him her name, told him again why she was there, told him that she was not a threat. As she stepped out of the vehicle, her laptop bag shifted on the passenger seat, and several items spilled onto the floor of the car. Among them was a leather folder embossed with an official seal, identification badges and a framed photograph. But Officer Matthews was too focused on maintaining what he perceived as control of the situation to notice these details. His backup had been called, and he could hear sirens approaching in the distance. Maya stood with her back against her car, hands still raised, while the officer kept his weapon trained on her. Neighbors had begun to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some recorded on their phones, while others called out, asking what was happening, whether everything was all right. The scene had drawn a crowd, and with it came questions that Officer Matthews was not prepared to answer. It was then that another patrol car arrived, and a second officer stepped out. Officer Sarah Chen had been on the force for 8 years, and had developed a reputation for level-headed decision-making. She took in the scene quickly, her eyes moving from the young woman with her hands raised to her colleague with his weapon drawn. Something about the situation did not sit right with her. She approached carefully, speaking in a calm voice, asking Matthews what was happening. As Officer Chen drew closer to Maya's vehicle, her eyes caught sight of the items that had spilled from the laptop bag. The leather folder lay open on the passenger seat, revealing credentials and identification that made her blood run cold. She moved closer to get a better look, her hand instinctively reaching out to her partner to signal him to lower his weapon. But Officer Matthews, tunnel-visioned and defensive, did not immediately respond. Officer Chen bent down to look into the car, and what she saw made her understand the gravity of the mistake that was unfolding before her. Among the scattered items was not just any identification, but credentials that carried significant weight and authority. There were photos showing Maya in official settings, documents bearing signatures of important figures, and awards that told a story of service and dedication. Officer Chen's face went pale as the realization hit her like a freight train. She straightened up quickly and moved toward Matthews, her voice urgent but controlled. She needed him to lower his weapon immediately, she told him. This was not what he thought it was. Not even close. Officer Matthews, confused by his colleague's sudden intervention and still pumped with adrenaline, hesitated. Officer Chen stepped closer, positioning herself between him and Maya, her body language making it clear that he needed to stand down right now. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Officer Matthews finally began to lower his weapon, his face showing confusion and the first hints of concern. Officer Chen turned to Maya, her voice apologetic as she asked if she was all right, if she needed medical attention. Maya, still shaking, nodded slowly, her hands finally coming down from above her head. She leaned against her car, her legs feeling weak beneath her, as she tried to process what had just happened. Officer Chen retrieved the leather folder from the passenger seat, handling it carefully as she showed it to Matthews. As his eyes scanned the credentials inside, the color drained from his face. His hands began to shake, and the weapon he had just holstered suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The name on the identification matched the name of the woman he had just held at gunpoint, but the title and position listed beneath it told a story he had never imagined. Officer Matthews stared at the credentials in disbelief, reading and rereading the words as if they might change. Dr. Maya Johnson, Special Advisor to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. The official seal stamped on the identification was unmistakable, and beneath it were clearance levels and authorizations that made his throat go dry. His hands continued to shake as Officer Chen quietly explained that Dr. Johnson had been appointed 6 months earlier to lead a comprehensive review of police practices and racial bias in law enforcement across multiple states. This state was next on her list. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The very person who had been brought in to investigate and reform problematic policing practices had just been subjected to exactly the kind of encounter she had been tasked to prevent. Maya slowly lowered herself to sit on the curb, her professional composure cracking as the adrenaline began to fade, and the reality of what could have happened washed over her. She had studied countless cases, read hundreds of reports, interviewed dozens of families who had lost loved ones to police violence. But experiencing it firsthand was something entirely different. Officer Matthews felt his legs weaken beneath him. Everything he thought he knew about the situation had been turned completely upside down. This was not just any citizen he had drawn his weapon on. This was someone with the power to impact his career, his department, and potentially his freedom. But more than that, and this was only beginning to dawn on him, this was a human being he had terrorized based on nothing more than the color of her skin and his own prejudices. The weight of that realization began to crush down on him. By now, more officers had arrived on the scene, along with a supervisor, Lieutenant Marcus Thompson. Thompson was a veteran of 25 years who had seen his share of controversial stops, but when Officer Chen briefed him on the situation, his expression grew grave. He approached Dr. Johnson carefully, introducing himself and offering his sincere apologies for what had occurred. Maya looked up at him, her eyes still wet with tears, and nodded acknowledgement. She was trying to maintain her professional bearing, but her voice cracked as she spoke about feeling terrified for her life. Lieutenant Thompson turned to Officer Matthews, his disappointment evident in every line of his face. He asked Matthews to explain his actions, to walk him through his decision-making process. Matthews tried to articulate his reasoning, talking about the length of time the car had been stopped, the movement toward the glove compartment, his training about officer safety. But as he spoke the words aloud, surrounded by witnesses and recording devices, hearing them played back in the presence of someone who literally wrote policy about these exact scenarios, his justification sounded hollow even to his own ears. The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, and among them were people who recognized Dr. Johnson from news coverage of her appointment. Word began to spread through the gathering about who she was and what had just happened. A local news van pulled up at the end of the street, having heard about the incident through police scanner traffic. The situation was rapidly spiraling into something much bigger than a simple traffic stop, and everyone present knew it. Dr. Johnson stood up slowly, straightening her blazer and wiping her eyes. Despite everything that had just happened, despite the trauma she had just experienced, her training and her commitment to her mission began to take over. She looked directly at Officer Matthews, her voice steady now despite the lingering tremor in her hands. She told him that this was exactly what she had been sent to address. This was the problem laid bare for everyone to see. His actions, his assumptions, his decision to escalate rather than de-escalate, all of it represented systemic issues that were costing lives. Officer Matthews felt something break inside him. For the first time in his 15 years of service, he was being forced to confront the reality of his actions without the usual protections of police solidarity, or the benefit of doubt automatically extended to law enforcement. He was standing face to face with someone who had dedicated her life to fighting the very prejudices he had just displayed. More than that, he was facing the undeniable truth that he could have killed an innocent woman based on nothing more than racist assumptions. His knees began to buckle, and Officer Chen reached out to steady him, but he pushed past her. In a moment that stunned everyone watching, Officer Matthews dropped to his knees in front of Dr. Johnson. His service weapon, his badge, the uniform he had worn with pride for so many years, all of it suddenly felt like a costume hiding an ugly truth he could no longer deny. Tears began to stream down his face as the full weight of what he had done, what he had almost done, crashed over him like a tidal wave. The crowd fell silent, phones still recording, witnesses to a moment of reckoning that felt both deeply personal and universally significant. Dr. Johnson looked down at the officer kneeling before her, her expression complex. There was anger there, certainly. Fear still lingered in her eyes, but there was also something else, something that came from years of trying to understand how good people could do terrible things, how systems could corrupt individual morality, how prejudice could blind even those who thought themselves fair. Officer Matthews spoke through his tears, his voice broken and raw. He apologized, but not with the careful, lawyer-approved language of official police statements. He apologized like a man who had just seen himself clearly for the first time, and was horrified by the reflection. He talked about his fear, about his assumptions, about how he had convinced himself his actions were about safety when they were really about prejudice. He had not seen her as a person, he admitted. He had seen a stereotype, a threat that existed only in his biased mind. Lieutenant Thompson watched the scene unfold, knowing that every word being spoken was being recorded, knowing that this incident would have far-reaching consequences. He also knew that what was happening right now, this moment of raw honesty and confrontation, was more real than any training seminar or policy manual could ever be. This was the reality of racial bias in policing, stripped of all the bureaucratic language and defensive posturing, laid bare in the middle of a suburban street. Dr. Johnson remained standing, looking down at the kneeling officer. She did not tell him to get up. She did not immediately accept his apology. Instead, she began to speak, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet street. She talked about the fear she had felt, about seeing that gun pointed at her and knowing that her life hung in the balance. She talked about being excellent at her job, highly educated, professionally dressed and cooperative, and how none of that had mattered when confronted with racial prejudice. She spoke about all the others who had been in similar situations, those who did not have the credentials to protect them, those whose names had become hashtags and rallying cries. She talked about fathers pulled over on their way home from work, teenagers walking through their own neighborhoods, mothers reaching for their license and registration. She talked about how many of those encounters had ended not with tears and apologies but with funerals, and devastated families. The neighbors listened, some nodding, some crying, some angry, all bearing witness to a moment that encapsulated so much of the national conversation about race and policing. The news crew had set up their camera capturing the scene. This was going to be national news within hours. Everyone present understood that. But more importantly, this was a teaching moment, a chance for real change to begin. Officer Matthews remained on his knees, his body shaking with the force of his emotional breakdown. He had spent years building walls around his prejudices, justifying them as experience, as street smarts, as necessary caution. Those walls had just crumbled, and he was left facing the ugliness he had been protecting. He looked up at Dr. Johnson, his eyes red and swollen, and asked a question that seemed to surprise even himself. He asked her what he could do to be better, how he could change, how someone like him could possibly make amends for years of this kind of behavior. Dr. Johnson felt her anger warring with her sense of purpose. This man had traumatized her, had pointed a loaded weapon at her for no legitimate reason, had made her fear for her life. Every instinct told her to reject his apology, to ensure he faced the full consequences of his actions. But she had also spent years studying how people changed, how systems reformed, how cycles of violence and prejudice could be broken. She had seen officers fired and prosecuted, and she had seen how rarely that actually changed anything in the broader culture of policing. She took a deep breath and told Officer Matthews to stand up. Her voice was firm but not cruel. She explained that his question about how to be better was exactly the right question, but it had to come with understanding that change required more than just feeling sorry. It required action, accountability, and a willingness to be uncomfortable for a very long time. Matthews rose slowly to his feet, wiping his face with his sleeve, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. Lieutenant Thompson stepped forward, informing Officer Matthews that he was suspended immediately pending a full investigation. His weapon and badge were confiscated on the spot. The other officers present watched as their colleague was stripped of the symbols of his authority, a stark reminder that actions had consequences. But Dr. Johnson held up her hand, asking the lieutenant if she could speak with him privately for a moment. The two moved a short distance away, and those watching could see an intense conversation taking place. When they returned, Lieutenant Thompson announced that Dr. Johnson had made an unusual request. She wanted Officer Matthews to remain involved in this situation, not as a police officer, but as a participant in her research and reform program. She wanted him to understand from the inside what it meant to be on the other side of police prejudice, to face the system he had been a part of, and to help develop training that could prevent other officers from making the same mistakes. It was not mercy, she made clear. It was an opportunity for him to do the hard work of change. The crowd reacted with mixed emotions. Some felt he was getting off too easy, that he should be fired and prosecuted. Others saw the wisdom in Dr. Johnson's approach, understanding that one officer going to jail would not change the culture that had created him. Maya knew that her decision would be controversial, but she also knew that real reform required transforming people, not just punishing them. Matthews would still face all the official consequences of his actions, but he would also become a case study in rehabilitation and education. Over the next few days, the incident exploded across national media. The video footage taken by neighbors went viral within hours. News outlets ran stories with headlines about a Justice Department official being held at gunpoint during a traffic stop. Think pieces and opinion columns flooded newspapers and websites. Some focused on Dr. Johnson's grace and wisdom in handling the situation. Others demanded harsher punishment for Officer Matthews. Everyone had an opinion about what should happen next. Dr. Johnson found herself thrust into an even brighter spotlight than her appointment already created. She gave interviews, appeared on news programs, and wrote an opinion piece for a major newspaper about her experience. She talked about the fear she had felt, but also about her commitment to reform over retribution. She explained that if police officers never had the chance to truly confront their biases and change, the cycle would simply continue with the next generation of cops. Her approach was not popular with everyone, but it sparked important conversations. Officer Matthews, meanwhile, had been placed on administrative leave and was facing both departmental and federal civil rights investigations. He had been stripped of his badge and gun, and his future in law enforcement was uncertain at best. But Dr. Johnson had also arranged for him to begin an intensive program that included bias training, community immersion experiences, and direct conversations with families who had lost loved ones to police violence. He was required to document his journey and participate in the development of new training programs. The first few sessions were brutal for Matthews. He was forced to sit in rooms with people who had every reason to hate him, to listen to their stories without being able to defend himself or make excuses. He heard from mothers who had buried sons, from children who had watched their fathers die, from community members who feared police more than they feared criminals. Each story chipped away at the defensive walls he had built around his conscience. Each testimony forced him to confront the human cost of the prejudices he had carried. One particularly difficult session involved watching body camera footage from other police shootings, cases where officers had made split-second decisions based on racial bias. Dr. Johnson sat beside him as they watched, pausing the videos to discuss what the officers were thinking, what assumptions they were making, how their training had failed them. Matthews saw himself in these other officers, recognized the same thought patterns, the same fear-based responses, the same inability to see the people in front of them as individuals rather than threats. Dr. Johnson also arranged for Matthews to spend time in the communities he had patrolled, but not as an officer. He volunteered at community centers, helped serve meals at food banks, attended church services, and sat in on neighborhood meetings. He was introduced simply as Derek, someone who was trying to learn and do better. Some people recognized him from the news coverage and confronted him angrily. He took their anger without defending himself, learning to sit with the discomfort of being held accountable. Through all of this, Dr. Johnson continued her broader work. The incident with Officer Matthews had actually strengthened her position in some ways, giving her first-hand experience that added weight to her recommendations. She used the attention the incident had generated to push for policy changes, including mandatory bias training, better screening of officer candidates, reformed use of force policies, and increased accountability measures. The fact that she had chosen a path of reform rather than simply seeking punishment actually gave her more credibility with police departments who had been resistant to her work. Officer Matthews began to change in ways that surprised even Dr. Johnson. The defensive, arrogant cop who had pulled her over was slowly being replaced by someone who seemed genuinely committed to understanding and addressing his prejudices. He started reading books about racism and policing, watching documentaries, engaging in difficult conversations with his own family about their biases. His wife, who had initially been defensive of him, began to see the changes in her husband and started her own journey of education and awareness. 3 months after the incident, Dr. Johnson organized a community forum where Officer Matthews would speak publicly about his experience for the first time. The auditorium was packed with community members, police officers, activists, and media. The tension in the room was palpable as Matthews took the stage. He stood at the podium looking out at the sea of faces, some sympathetic, many hostile, all waiting to hear what he had to say. Matthews spoke for nearly an hour, detailing his journey from that day on the street to where he stood now. He did not make excuses. He talked about the racist assumptions that had guided his policing, about the fear and prejudice that had almost led him to shoot an innocent woman, about the culture within law enforcement that had reinforced and rewarded his biased behavior. He talked about the pain he had caused Dr. Johnson and countless others over his years as an officer. He acknowledged that some people in the room would never forgive him, and he accepted that. But he also talked about what he was learning, about the ways his eyes had been opened, about the community members who had shown him grace when they had no reason to. He talked about his commitment to spending the rest of his life working to undo the harm he had caused, and to help prevent other officers from following the same destructive path. When he finished speaking, the room was silent for a long moment before questions began, some hostile, some curious, all challenging him to prove that his transformation was real. Dr. Johnson watched from the side of the stage, her expression thoughtful. This was far from over. Matthews had a long road ahead of him, and there would be setbacks and challenges. But she had seen something in his eyes during their many sessions together, a genuine willingness to dismantle everything he thought he knew and rebuild his understanding of justice and humanity. Whether he would ultimately succeed remained to be seen, but the attempt itself was worth something. 6 months after the incident, the official investigations into Officer Matthews had concluded. The findings were damning but not entirely surprising. The review uncovered a pattern of discriminatory stops and excessive use of force complaints throughout his career, most of which had been dismissed or minimized by the department. The federal civil rights investigation found sufficient evidence that Matthews had violated Dr. Johnson's constitutional rights. He faced the possibility of criminal charges, loss of his pension, and permanent disqualification from law enforcement. But Dr. Johnson submitted testimony on his behalf, not to excuse his actions but to document the transformation she had witnessed. She described the intensive rehabilitation program he had completed, the genuine remorse he had demonstrated, and the potential value he could provide in reforming police training. Her testimony carried significant weight, though it remained controversial in many circles. Some activists accused her of being too lenient, of prioritizing the redemption of one racist cop over justice for the countless victims of police violence. Dr. Johnson understood their anger and acknowledged it publicly. She wrote about the struggle between her desire for accountability and her belief in the possibility of change. She admitted that she sometimes questioned her own decision, wondered if she was being naive or if her commitment to reform was blinding her to the need for harsher punishment. But she also knew that the traditional approach of simply firing problem officers only sent them to other departments or left the underlying culture unchanged. She was trying something different, using her experience as a catalyst for deeper systemic change. The police department where Matthews had worked was now facing its own reckoning. Dr. Johnson's investigation, which had been accelerated and intensified following her own encounter with discrimination, revealed widespread problems. Minority residents were stopped at rates 3 times higher than white residents. Use of force incidents were concentrated in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods. Complaint procedures were deliberately complicated and complaints were rarely sustained. The department's leadership had fostered a culture that rewarded aggressive policing and dismissed concerns about bias. Lieutenant Thompson, who had been at the scene that day, became an unexpected ally in the reform effort. He had been approaching retirement and could have simply tried to run out the clock, but the incident had affected him deeply. He began working with Dr. Johnson to implement new policies and training procedures. He faced significant resistance from other officers who saw him as a traitor to the Blue Line, but he persisted, arguing that true support for police meant holding them to higher standards and addressing the systemic problems that made their jobs harder. Officer Sarah Chen, who had intervened during the stop, was promoted and put in charge of implementing the new bias training program. She worked closely with Dr. Johnson and surprisingly with Matthews himself. Chen had always tried to police with fairness and compassion, but even she learned things about her own unconscious biases through the process. She became a vocal advocate for reform within the department, using her credibility as a respected officer to challenge her colleagues to do better. Matthews, for his part, had become the face of a controversial rehabilitation program. He spoke at police academies and training conferences, sharing his story with brutal honesty. He showed his body camera footage from the day he stopped Dr. Johnson, walking audiences through his thought process at each moment, identifying where his training had failed him and where his prejudices had taken over. Many officers in these audiences were hostile, seeing him as someone who had thrown his fellow cops under the bus. But others listened carefully, recognizing their own patterns in his confession. The work was exhausting and often depressing for Matthews. He received death threats from both sides, from people who thought he was being treated too leniently, and from those who saw him as a traitor to law enforcement. His marriage survived but was strained. His adult children struggled with their feelings about their father, proud of his efforts to change but horrified by what they were learning about his past actions. He had lost friends, lost his career, and lost the identity he had built over 15 years. All he had left was the difficult work of becoming someone better. Dr. Johnson's reform program expanded beyond that single police department. Using the publicity from her case, she secured funding and support to implement similar programs in other cities. She developed a curriculum that centered on humanizing the communities police served, on understanding the history of racism in law enforcement, and on providing tools for officers to recognize and counteract their own biases. Matthews became a key part of these training sessions, though his presence was always controversial. The program paired officers with community members for extended dialogue sessions. Officers heard directly from people about their experiences with police, about the fear and trauma that even routine traffic stops caused in communities of color. Community members heard from officers about the pressures and fears they faced, the ways their training and culture pushed them toward aggressive responses. These conversations were often tense and painful, but they began to break down some of the walls between police and the communities they served. One particularly powerful session involved Matthews meeting with a family whose teenage son had been killed by police 3 years earlier. The circumstances were different from his stop of Dr. Johnson, but the underlying prejudices were similar. The officer in that case had perceived a threat where none existed, had escalated when he should have de-escalated, had seen a young black man as dangerous rather than scared. The family had agreed to meet with Matthews as part of the program, though they made clear they were doing it to educate, not to forgive. Matthews listened as the mother described her son, a bright student who played saxophone and dreamed of becoming an engineer. She showed him photos, report cards, birthday videos. She made him see her son as a complete human being, not the threatening figure described in the police report. Then she described receiving the phone call that every parent dreads, arriving at the hospital to find her son already gone, the years of grief and anger that followed. Matthews wept openly as she spoke, but she did not comfort him. This was not about his feelings. This was about him understanding the stakes of the work he had been called to do. By the end of the first year after the incident, measurable changes were beginning to show in the departments where Dr. Johnson's programs had been implemented. Complaint rates had actually gone up initially, which Dr. Johnson explained was a positive sign that communities felt they would be taken seriously. But use of force incidents had decreased by 30%. Traffic stops showed less racial disparity. Community surveys indicated slightly increased trust in police, though trust remained low overall. It was progress, but there was still so much work to be done. Matthews had been offered a position, not as a police officer, but as a full-time trainer and program coordinator for Dr. Johnson's initiative. It paid less than half what he had made as a cop, and it required him to face hostility and skepticism every day. He accepted the position, understanding that this was likely the only meaningful work he would ever do again. His role was to be the cautionary tale, the example of how good intentions and noble ideas about serving and protecting could be corrupted by unchecked prejudice and a toxic culture. Dr. Johnson continued to process her own trauma from that day on the street. She had gone to therapy, had worked through the fear and anger, but she still sometimes had nightmares about the gun pointed at her window. She still felt her pulse quicken when she saw police cars in her rearview mirror. She understood that she was not obligated to forgive Matthews or to use her trauma as a teaching tool, but she had chosen to try to create something meaningful from that awful experience, to use her position and her story to push for the kind of systemic change that might prevent the next Maya Johnson from facing the same terror. Relationship between Dr. Johnson and Matthews remained complex and professional. They were not friends and likely never would be. She did not trust him fully and maintained clear boundaries. But they had become partners in a shared mission, connected by a terrible incident that had revealed both the worst and the potential for better in the American criminal justice system. Their continued work together was a statement about the possibility of accountability, without simply resorting to punishment, about reform that centered healing and change rather than retribution. 2 years had passed since that afternoon when Officer Derek Matthews had pointed his gun at Dr. Maya Johnson. The incident had become a landmark case in discussions about police reform, studied in criminal justice courses, and referenced in policy debates. The video footage was used in training sessions across the country as an example of how quickly bias could escalate a routine interaction into a potentially deadly encounter. Both Maya and Derek had become public figures, their lives forever changed by those few terrifying minutes on a quiet suburban street. The National Police Reform Conference was being held in Chicago, and both Maya and Derek were scheduled to speak. The event drew thousands of attendees, including police chiefs, government officials, community activists, and academics. There was significant controversy about Derek's inclusion on the speaker list. Protesters gathered outside the convention center with signs demanding that reformed police training focus on accountability and termination of racist officers rather than rehabilitation. They had a point, Maya acknowledged privately. The question of whether people like Derek deserved a second chance remained divisive and deeply personal. Maya stood backstage, reviewing her notes for what felt like the 100th time. Her presentation would cover the comprehensive data from the reform programs implemented across 12 cities. The results were mixed but encouraging. Use of force incidents were down an average of 42% in participating departments. Traffic stop disparities had narrowed, though not disappeared. Most significantly, officer surveys showed increased awareness of bias and greater willingness to challenge problematic behavior among peers. Community trust remained low but was slowly improving in areas where reforms had been maintained consistently. Derek was scheduled to speak after Maya, and she could see him pacing nervously in the wings. He had lost weight over the past 2 years, and his face carried lines that had not been there before. The work of confronting his own racism and its consequences had aged him, but there was also something different in his eyes. The defensive arrogance was gone, replaced by a kind of somber determination. He caught her looking and gave a slight nod. Their relationship remained professional and distant, but there was a mutual understanding between them now, forged through countless difficult conversations and shared commitment to the work. When Maya took the stage, she was greeted by enthusiastic applause from some sections and stony silence from others. She began by acknowledging the controversy of her approach, validating the anger and skepticism that many felt about rehabilitation programs for officers who had demonstrated bias. She shared new data about the psychological impact of discriminatory policing on communities, the generational trauma that accumulated when parents had to teach their children to fear the people who were supposed to protect them. She talked about the economic costs, the lost productivity, the health consequences of living with constant vigilance and stress. Then she presented the case for transformation alongside accountability. She explained that the traditional approach of firing problem officers had failed to change departmental cultures because it allowed other officers to maintain their biases while simply becoming more careful about documentation. Real change required forcing officers to confront the humanity of the people they served, to understand the impact of their actions, and to develop new mental patterns for assessing situations. It was uncomfortable, time-consuming, and uncertain, but early results suggested it might actually work where other interventions had failed. Maya showed video clips from training sessions, including footage of officers breaking down as they listened to community members describe their experiences. She shared testimonials from officers who had completed the program and reported changing their approach to their work. She presented data on complaint patterns, showing that officers who went through intensive bias training received fewer complaints in subsequent years. She was careful to note that this was not about excusing harmful behavior, but about creating actual change rather than simply reshuffling problem officers to different departments. When Derek took the stage, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He stood at the podium for a long moment, looking out at an audience that ranged from curious to openly hostile. He began by stating clearly that nothing he was about to say was meant to excuse his actions or to position himself as the victim of his own racism. He acknowledged that he had terrorized Dr. Joe. He had carried those same prejudices throughout his years as an officer, affecting countless people whose names he would never know. Derek talked about growing up in a family where casual racism was normal, where stereotypes about black people were presented as facts, where fear of the other was cultivated and reinforced. He described joining the police force with genuine intentions to serve and protect, but how those intentions had been warped by a culture that rewarded suspicion and aggression toward minority communities. He talked about the ways officers reinforced each other's biases, how they told stories that painted certain neighborhoods and certain people as inherently dangerous, how they created an us versus them mentality that made empathy impossible. He described that day when he pulled over Dr. Johnson, walking the audience through his thought process. He explained how he had looked at her and immediately made assumptions based on her race, how his training about officer safety had been filtered through his prejudices to create a false sense of threat, how his adrenaline and fear had overridden any ability to see her as an individual person. He showed his own body camera footage, which still made him feel sick to watch, and pointed out each moment where he could have chosen differently but did not. Derek talked about what had happened since, the brutal process of education and accountability he had undergone. He described sitting with families who had lost loved ones to police violence, the unbearable weight of their grief, the knowledge that he had caused similar pain to people throughout his career. He talked about the anger he had faced from his former colleagues who saw him as a traitor, and the skepticism from activists and community members who doubted the sincerity of his transformation. He acknowledged that both groups had legitimate reasons for their positions, but he also talked about change being possible, not to let himself off the hook, but because he had seen it in himself and in other officers who had gone through the program. He talked about the officers who had come to him privately after training sessions, confessing their own biases and asking for help changing. He talked about the slow, difficult work of reshaping thought patterns that had been reinforced for years or decades. He talked about the responsibility of officers who had seen the light to speak up and challenge the culture that had created them, even when it cost them friendships and career advancement. The question and answer session that followed was intense. A woman whose brother had been killed by police stood up and asked Derek directly why he deserved a chance at redemption when her brother would never get a chance at anything again. Derek did not have a good answer. He acknowledged that he did not deserve redemption, that forgiveness was not owed to him, that his life's work from this point forward could never truly balance the scales. But he said he was choosing to do the work anyway, because the alternative was to give up. And giving up would dishonor the people he had harmed even more than he already had. A police chief from a major city challenged Maya, asking whether her approach was realistic, given the realities of police work and the need for officer safety. Maya responded firmly that officer safety was important, but that the overwhelming majority of police encounters did not involve actual threats. She presented statistics showing that officers were more likely to die in traffic accidents than in confrontations with armed suspects, yet traffic safety training received a fraction of the emphasis given to threat assessment. She argued that the current approach actually made officers less safe by destroying community relationships and creating a cycle of fear and hostility. A young activist stood and spoke passionately about how no amount of training would matter if officers faced no real consequences for their actions. She pointed out that Derek still had his freedom, his life, and now even a platform and career built on his reputation as a reformed racist. Meanwhile, the people his biases had affected carried permanent scars or were in graves. She demanded to know what justice looked like in a system that seemed more interested in rehabilitating racist cops than in protecting their victims. Maya took the question, acknowledging its validity. She explained that she had struggled with this exact issue, that she sometimes lay awake at night wondering if she had made the right choice. She said that the traditional justice system had consistently failed to hold police accountable, that convictions were rare and meaningful punishment, even rarer. She had chosen to try a different approach not because she thought it was perfect, but because the alternative had demonstrably not worked. She emphasized that her program did not replace accountability, but supplemented it, that officers still faced administrative and legal consequences while also being required to do the deep work of transformation. After the formal session ended, something unexpected happened. A group of police officers approached Derek and Maya, asking to speak with them privately. In a conference room away from the main event, these officers confessed their own struggles with bias. They talked about the fear and prejudice they carried, the ways their training and culture had shaped their perceptions, their desire to do better but lack of knowledge about how. They asked if the program could be expanded, if there was a way for officers to voluntarily participate before they made career-ending mistakes. This conversation lasted for hours and became the genesis of a new initiative. Maya and Derek worked with these officers to develop a voluntary bias intervention program, one that allowed officers to confidentially address their prejudices before they resulted in harm. It was controversial because it required police departments to acknowledge that many of their officers carried problematic biases. But several forward-thinking chiefs agreed to pilot the program, understanding that prevention was better than dealing with the aftermath of bias-driven incidents. Over the following months, enrollment in the voluntary program exceeded all expectations. Hundreds of officers from departments across the country requested to participate. Many of them came from backgrounds similar to Derek's, raised with racist attitudes that they had never questioned until joining a profession where those attitudes could cost lives. Others had developed biases through their experiences on the job, their worldviews shaped by the worst moments and worst actors they encountered. All of them were looking for a path forward that did not require them to pretend their prejudices did not exist. The program created cohorts of officers who met regularly to discuss their biases, their experiences, and their struggles to change. They were paired with community members for ongoing dialogue. They studied the history of racism in America and in policing. They examined case studies of discriminatory policing and its consequences. They practiced new approaches to common situations, learning to pause and question their assumptions before acting. The process was uncomfortable and often painful, but participants reported that it was transforming how they understood their role and their responsibility. Maya found herself cautiously optimistic for the first time in years. The data from the expanded program showed promising trends. More importantly, she was hearing stories of real change in how officers interacted with communities. There were accounts of officers de-escalating situations they might have previously escalated, of officers intervening when they saw colleagues acting on bias, of officers building genuine relationships with community members they had previously feared or dismissed. It was not a complete solution, but it was progress. Derek continued his work as a trainer and advocate, though he never forgot that his position was built on the foundation of his failures. He saved letters he received from people he had harmed during his years as an officer, reading them regularly to remind himself of the stakes of his work. He knew that many people would never forgive him, and that he did not deserve their forgiveness, but he also knew that giving up would be the ultimate betrayal of the people who had suffered because of his prejudices. So he kept working, kept speaking, kept pushing himself and other officers to be better. On the 3rd anniversary of that traffic stop, Maya and Derek appeared together on a national news program. The host asked Maya if she regretted her decision to work with Derek, rather than simply pursuing his prosecution. Maya paused before answering, her face thoughtful. She said that she still sometimes questioned her choice, that she carried the trauma of that day with her, that she understood why people criticized her approach. But she also said that the work they had done together had reached thousands of officers and might have prevented hundreds of harmful encounters. She said that had to count for something. The host turned to Derek and asked what he would say to officers who were watching and who carried similar biases. Derek looked directly into the camera and spoke with quiet intensity. He said that he knew many officers believed they were not racist because they did not burn crosses or use slurs, but he said that bias was more subtle and more dangerous than overt hatred. He said that every officer needed to examine honestly what assumptions they made about people based on their race, what fears they carried, what stories they told themselves to justify treating some communities differently than others. He said that being a good officer required the courage to confront ugly truths about yourself and the commitment to change even when it was hard. In the years that followed,